through it if I have to go through it. And brothers and sisters, if you live here anytime, you got to go through something. Who do we think we are that we're not going through something? Why do we feel Jesus went through so much? The Apostle Paul went through so much. The apostles of the Bible in the early church went through a lot. The prophets went through something. Abraham almost killed his own son. Noah had to go through a rainstorm. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. Daniel in the lion den. Everybody, if you live close to God, you got to go through something. The only thing about us, when we're having trouble, we have a way of thinking we're the only one having trouble. But I come to tell you, everybody's got something to go through. And you have to learn that you got to go through it. There's no way around it. You can't jump over it. When it gets to that point, then all you can say is, Lord, take me through the trial. That's all. That's all. Take me through. Hold my hand. Guide my footsteps while I make it, while I make this journey. Give me the power to deal with that I don't feel like I want to deal with. Help me to get over that hurdle that won't get out of the way. Help me to bear that cross that nobody else can carry but me. The Apostle Paul was in this. I wish I had time to move on to this. A part here that I want to get across to you this morning. What follows then becomes an exchange with Festus and Felix. You remember those two. Festus and Felix tried to meet with him. In other words, they almost said, let us talk to him. We want to talk some sense in the Apostle Paul. He's too valuable a man to lose here. He was a good Pharisee and he was a great ruler of the Jews. Now he's with this new band that he calls Christian. We don't know what happened to him, but let's talk some sense into his head. And so they took him on the side and they told him, I tell you what you do, Paul. Why don't you plead insanity? That you didn't know what you were saying at the time when you were preaching about the resurrection, that you had a mind lapse of some kind and something went wrong. You had some kind of breakdown. Why don't you plead insanity? All they want you to do is refuse to talk about the resurrection. Pull back your statements, recant the resurrection. In other words, just say, I'm not sure how Jesus got out of the grave. Just say that it was not a holy and a divine resurrection. Just tell them they don't believe in the resurrection. They feel responsible here at Jerusalem for the death of Jesus. They thought he was nothing but another martyr that they were trying to make. So if you stand up in the court of Agrippa and simply tell him and tell everybody that the resurrection didn't take place, but Paul said, I'm sorry, I can't do that. I'm standing on a promise that God made to us, that those who are dead, yet shall they live. I'm standing on the promise that if you believe there is life after death. I'm standing on the promise that Jesus is the resurrection and the life. I'm standing on the promise that whatever go on in society, that when we die, we shall live again. I don't know about you, my Holly, but I'm looking forward to living again. I mean, living without pains, living without problems, living without bills to pay, living without crosses to carry, living without worrying about what folks say about you, living on, resting, battle fought, and the victory won. That's what Jesus has promised to all of us, that it's better on the other side than it is on this side, that there is a bright side somewhere, that we shall wake up in glory and tell the story of how God brought us over, and our souls will look back and wonder how we got over. Well, that's what he has promised to everybody who live right. I don't know about you, but I'm striving to make that a reality. The Hall of Fame that we have in the Bible, but from the text that was preached by Dr. Taylor, that's the Hall of Fame in there. Those who slept in the Lord, those who believed that they would see another city, one that was not built by hand. We have so many, from my knowledge, Sister the Park called some of the road, but there's a long road there of people, the battle fought and victory won. No matter what you think, Yes, we're renewing. Yes, we're getting new pews and all. But somebody's sweat and tears are already in this church. The pennies they had to put together to build the church as it is. It's all right for us to remodel, and it's easy for us to criticize what's here because most of us didn't put it here. Somebody else put it here through their own pennies and their own struggle. We stand on a firm foundation. For 66 years, this church has been here crying like a voice in the wilderness. We thank God. Somebody said, Brother Crayton, that was a nice thing you did, but I didn't do anything that wasn't deserving of the person. Had it not been for an R.D. Brown, who knows how my own life would have been shaped. Every now and then we got to look back and thank somebody back there for helping us along the way. There's nothing wrong with that. You're not praising and worshiping them. You're worshiping God. I know how to worship God, but I know how to say thank you, R.D. Brown, for what you meant in my own life. And every now and then we got to remember about that. Well, the Apostle Paul said, I'm sorry, I can't plead insanity. I'm in my right mind. I can't recant about the resurrection because I'm standing on the promise, a promise that God has made to us. He made it to our fathers. He made it to the patriarchs. He made it down through the years. He said if we live right, that God would reward us. Isaiah said, I see him with dry garments on, treading the winepress alone. A brand new day, a better day for our world. You got to have faith to be able to see beyond where you are. So the Apostle Paul was rushed in the King Agrippa's court. And the Bible said they set the hearing for a certain day. And the king came out in pomp. He and his wife Bernice, they came out and sat on the throne. Unusual now that a king would hear the hearing of this particular man. Usually kings would not deal with this, but they turned the palace into a king's court. And now Paul will turn the king's court and palace into a church. He'll have to make that transformation. He'll have to make it because he has nothing else he can stand on. For what else can he draw on except what God has already told him? Well, in walked King Agrippa. And I wish I had time to paint it this morning. But then came King Agrippa, the glistering of royalty, the purple drape down from the throne, the elders around, the princes coming around. But this was a different type of royal setting. Nobody would be there to say, long live the king. Nobody would be there to offer toasts to the king. It would be a different kind of setting. They turned the king's palace into a place of hearing, a courtroom, because here comes the second man that has turned the world upside down. We thought we killed the other one by putting him on the cross. Then we beheaded one called John the Baptist. We crucified one called Jesus. And now we got another one standing before us. The Apostle Paul had shaken up everything in Jerusalem, declared a holiday. Synagogues had closed up. The temples had gone out, lost their power. The priests and elders had no more power. The Pharisees sat down and couldn't do anything. The scribes and the elders and the Sadducees were all canceled. The Apostle Paul stood before King Agrippa. King Agrippa looked around and listened for the charges. Somebody said heresy. Somebody said he's a hypocrite. Somebody said he's teaching false religion. Somebody else said he's preaching and teaching a new and a wrong kind of religion. Somebody else accused him of going against the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They hurled accusation that there was not one witness that would stand up for him. There wasn't even Barnabas there. And I often wonder, preachers, where was Barnabas? What had happened to him? What had happened even to young Timothy? Where was Titus? Where was the bunch that he had already recruited? But Paul, like Jesus, was standing alone. Somebody know what I'm talking about. For when things get rough, your friends will forsake you, walk out on you, leave you by yourself, and make you think that you're standing all by yourself. But I know that if you stand for God, he will. I wish I had time to preach this one, but he will stand right by your side. So King Agrippa looked around, didn't see this accuser, didn't know what to do. But he said then, after they brought him in and hurled the accusation, he said, well, I tell you what I'm going to do, Paul? I'm going to let you speak for yourself. Now that's all a child of God needs, is to speak for himself. Because if you don't have a testimony, nobody else has one for you. You ought to know what you've been through, how good God has been for you. If you can't sing on the choir, you ought to have a testimony. If you can't preach, having been called to preach, you ought to have a testimony. You can't play like Brother Jenkins. You can't work the way Sister DuPont works. You can't do the work of the deacon. You can't work like other folk work in the church. Well, if you can't do anything, you may not have the skills of a Deborah McCrae. You may not have the leadership skills of those like Sister Hudson who bore the burden here in the church, and like Sister Kirkland. You may not have the kind of longevity like Sister Hennett to stay on the job and whatnot like that, but you ought to have a testimony. There's something wrong with somebody who say they know God and don't have a testimony. You ought to be able to wake up 5 o'clock in the morning and have something to say about the Lord. They ought to be able to stop you on the street somewhere and ask you, do you know Jesus? You ought to be able to tell him he's a burden bearer, he's a heart fixer, and a way maker. You ought to have some kind of testimony. You ought to be able to tell somebody how good God is. Well, the Apostle Paul said, I've got a testimony. Let me speak for myself. Now you got to read it, Mama. I wish I had time. When you go home, but he stood there and said, everything I've been accused. Now he does a strange thing, Brother Leroy, in that. Mother Crown, let me tell you what he does. He does not really recant anything. He doesn't deny anything at all. He doesn't call anybody to be a witness. He doesn't have a defense of his own. All he does is testify and tell them, I understand why you don't understand why I'm standing on what I believe. But what you got to understand is that I'm a different person than I used to be. The Paul you knew, the Saul you knew, persecuted the church. The Saul you knew was a Pharisee, and a Pharisee alone. The Saul you knew the Lord but didn't have grace. The Saul that you knew something about faith but didn't exercise that faith. The Saul you knew breathed out threatening against the church, and I was on my way down Damascus Road, had to get the authority of the king. I was going to put all those Christians out of business. I thought they were wrong against the church, against the Pharisaic council, and I strutted down Damascus Road. But I want to tell you, King Agrippa, something happened there. Can you imagine this going on in a trial inside a courtroom, not bringing any witnesses, the judge sitting there spellbound, the jury sitting there doing nothing, everybody sitting around, don't know what he's going to say next, and here he is talking about, I saw the light on Damascus Road, and I heard a voice speak to me, knock me down on the ground, and introduced himself. He said, I am Jesus. I'm Jesus, the one you're kicking against. I'm Jesus, the one you're fighting against. I'm Jesus, the one whose program you're trying to mess with. I'm Jesus, the one you're trying to put out of business. I'm Jesus. And I could take it a little bit further and add to his resume. Jesus, let me add